Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Canfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, a community working to promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out the list of Harbinger podcasts at harbingermedianetwork.com. The victory of Donald Trump and his Republican Party, and it is now quite a different party than it was in 2016 when he first won the US presidency, in the November 2024 elections in the US, is an obviously important political event, not just for the US, but internationally. There's a lot that's already been written and said about what's happened, but there are problems with a lot of it, and the left is only just now really starting to think seriously about what's to be done. So I'm really glad to be joined on this episode of Victor's Children by two guests in the US. Could you introduce yourselves, maybe moving from northeast and then southwards from there?
Thanks so much for having me on, David. I'm Natalia. I am based in New York. I'm a founding member of Tempest Collective, and I've been on the socialist left for about 20 years. I became a socialist through the height of immigrant rights struggles in 2006, and I also was part of the anti-war movement and been part of many different struggles over the years. But at the current time, my main work has been in Tempest for the last year. Thanks again for having me.
Hi, and I'm David McNally. I teach history at the University of Houston, where I'm also an editor of Spectre Journal. And my activism these days is largely associated with Faculty for Justice in Palestine at the University of Houston, a campaign that we are doing in defense of Haitians in Houston and the United States more generally at the moment. And with George Floyd's family, I sponsor the annual George Floyd Memorial Lecture at the University of Houston, literally less than a mile from where George Floyd grew up and went to school.
Thank you both. So I'd like to start by looking back at what's happened before we move forward to what's next for socialists and other radicals in the US. And then we, I think, should close with some brief discussion about the implications of what's happened in the US here in so-called Canada and beyond. So listeners who didn't listen to the last episode of Victor's Children might want to go back and listen to that, because in the last episode, I interviewed Aaron Amaral in New York about how the US got into the situation that it was in just prior to the elections. But before we look forward, let's just look back briefly, and I want to ask the question to both of you. How do you think we should understand the victories that Trump and the Republicans have just won?
Well, I'll jump in, and then I know David will have a lot to add on to what I start with. But I guess there's a lot to sort through that I think has implications from the extremely sober to also the opportunities, and I think we're going to get at both of those things throughout the course of the discussion. At core, it's extremely clear that Trump won with much more definitively than in 2020. He won 75 million plus votes. He won in all swing states. He won the popular vote. And I think one of the things that has been drawn out several places, but I'll repeat it here, is that this is not an election where suddenly tens of millions of people have decided to support Trump. This is an election where the overall dynamic is actually of disaffection. So it is true, and we do need to underlie the fact that Trump is growing his coalition and his base in different ways than in 2020. 2016. Sorry about that. I said 2020 before, but I meant 2016. But I think the underlying thing that I think a lot of people have pointed to is that actually the main dynamic here is the complete disaffection from Democratic voters who showed up in 2020 to support Biden and saw no reason to support Trump in 2020. Sorry. Oh my goodness. This is. I'm getting my dates all mishmashed. But so I think that, there were about 9 million less votes for Harris than for Biden this year compared to the previous election. And I think there's a lot to be said, and there's a lot of takes about why and how this happened. But I think the reality is that there's an underlying dynamic that's not unique only to the US, but that has a very particular sharp edge here, which is that the traditional parties have been completely unable to figure out how to rule, have been completely alienating to the people that they've previously relied on as a coalition and a base. And I guess I'll end and let David come in with more of the dynamics, because obviously there's a lot more to say. But I do think that over the last 4 years, in particular around the genocide in Gaza, but also I think with the campaign that Harris decided to run, and with the consolidated, more elite base that the Democrats rely on, that is their base, has always been their base, but there's obviously been, they've appealed to a broader coalition in the past. I think that they have very baldly showed the US electorate who they really are and what they really stand for. And that's it's not an appealing thing that they stand for. And that doesn't mean that Trump offers something unique and great to the people who decided to vote for him, but it does mean that he, at the very least, he looks at what's happening in this country and he's like, this is really bad and something has to change, which is something that obviously the Democrats are much more seen as being the status quo establishment party, and I think that they are completely disconnected from the reality of what life is like in the United States in 2024.
Yeah, that's really great. And what I'll really just contribute to Natalia's points is that this scenario that Natalia is describing fits with a much larger global context, particularly in the global north, but not exclusively so. And what I mean by that is we have been transitioning away from mainstream neoliberal politics since the global crisis of 2009. And what I mean by mainstream neoliberal politics is the sort of neoliberal consensus that we identified with the likes of Bill Clinton's administration in the US and Tony Blair's in Britain. This is to say, this period from the late 80s through the early 2000s, where the notion was that it had been correct to let the market rip and to significantly dismantle social welfare programs in order to make the economy leaner, meaner, and more competitive. But at the same time, they would hold kind of a centrist position. And by centrist, I mean right-wing liberalism. But for them, they described it as centrist. It was neither right nor left, and it would maintain some modicum of older commitments to not just shutting down borders, to maintaining globalization and trying to avoid trade wars, to openness with the world. And this is all the globalization rhetoric of that period. And of course, there was a period of time when the neoliberal globalization model produced economic growth in the global north. Profit rates were very high, and job creation had periods where it was reasonably robust, and it created a kind of social base for the mainstream. That absolutely ruptured with the global crisis of 2009. And what we saw in the aftermath of that crisis was the emergence of new energized forces on the right and the left. So, in the first wave, we think about the upsurge of Occupy, the Arab Spring, the Indignados in Spain, the movement of the squares across Europe, including Istanbul, and so on, and the growth of the right from the Tea Party inside and on the fringes of the Republicans in the US to the resurgence of some of the historically right-wing parties of Europe, like the National Front, which has now further transformed itself, but it was still the National Front under Marine Le Pen at the time. So we saw a hemorrhaging from the center towards the right and the left. And what has fundamentally happened, as Natalia is describing, is that if you try to play back to the old neoliberal consensus, it has no traction. People aren't there That's why you could get Obama getting elected on a program of so-called change. He appeared to be the transformative candidate. He was the candidate who looked like the break from the status quo. It's why Bernie Sanders could get traction. Again, an ostensibly left break on the Democratic Party. And it's also why you got the polarization on the right. So the center is disintegrating. And the Democrats essentially try to ignore that, and because that to address it for them would mean to address a systemic and sustained decline of capitalism in a context of growing working class anger. So that the Trumpites appear as the candidates of change. They appear the ones who recognize that this system is not working. And so, final point on this, for first Biden and then Harris to go around campaigning and saying that the economy is great, never better, and so on, was, to conclude on Natalia's point, completely detached from the reality experienced by millions and tens of millions of working class people. So you could see it coming, and their inability to recalibrate is another question. But the Trumpites represent a cry that the old order is collapsing and something new needs to be built. Unfortunately, as we know, it's ominous, right-wing, racist, misogynistic, and trans and anti-working class. But they position themselves as the force for change. And lo and behold, as Natalia says, they swept across the board.
Is there anything that you'd like to say about alternative explanations that are more influential, I think, than the ones that you've just summed up? The things that are really wrong and pose problems for the left in terms of making sense of what's just happened?
There's probably a list of them, but I guess to put out a few, there's definitely, I think I've been interested listening to more of the liberal media responses, that there's actually much more of a willingness amongst a section of those people to acknowledge that there was something wrong with this campaign and something wrong with the strategy that this campaign pursued, which is interesting because that did not happen in 2016. In 2016, I felt like the dominant thing was like, the problem is voters. The problem is people are backwards. And that exists now, of course, and is something that I think we have to respond to. That this is, that people have bad politics and have allowed the Democrats to lose. But I think the thing that a lot of people are pointing to in response to that is in particular, the referendums on abortion, that in 7 of 10 states that had referendums on abortion to enshrine abortion access, those passed resoundingly, including in places where Trump made huge gains and solidified wins. So that says something that, like, this is not a situation where every vote for Trump is somehow a support for Project 2025. Like, there are people who, despite the Democrats, and especially in the last wing of that campaign, trying to say, vote for us because we're going to support abortion, actually did not vote for Democrats, but did vote to support abortion. So I just think there's something, there's something interesting there in terms of where people are standing and where people actually are positioned politically, which is very hard to gauge, by the way, in the US, because we don't have a left-wing party to vote for, or even to have some kind of register of how many people would support a left vision as opposed to Trump's vision. Another argument that I've seen a lot is that the Democrats won because they supported too much what people call identity or identitarian issues. Like, somehow, like, because they have previously supported Black Lives Matter and trans rights, that people see them as only representing fringe interests, which I think we have to really wholesale reject, not least because this campaign, they didn't talk about these things at all. In fact, they dropped the support of trans rights from their platform. They dropped opposition to the death penalty from their platform. Like, actually across the board, they have dropped these issues. And I think what's happened is much more so that the Republicans have shaped an entire narrative of scapegoating that in particular is against immigrants and against trans people as huge explanations for why the Democrats don't support ordinary people. We really have to reject that, and we have to reshape an argument about the need to support and defend everyone, and how that's tied up to an overall class interest in and of itself. But I do think that the Democrats, like their support for Black Lives Matter and their support for trans rights, or and not to mention their opposition to immigrant rights, which they have wholesale accepted Trump's ramping up of the border security and deportations, which they've done throughout their legacy. But I do think that they have a very kind of symbolic support for communities, and I think that people's experience, in particular of the Obama years, has really been kind of solidified the fact that their allegiances are much more to representational and kind of more surface level changes than things that have actually produced different outcomes, and how pervasive the racism and xenophobia actually is within the system, that they haven't actually made inroads towards addressing that despite campaigning and winning elections on those issues. But I think there's more to say about that. And then the last one I'll reference is I think that like I listened to Bernie Sanders did an interview with the Daily the other day, and he's very much like, the Democrats lost because they did not talk about working class issues. And if only they were talking about working class issues, like people would see their lives represented and see some kind of vehicle within the Democrats and would have come out to support. And I think that I think it's a really, really positive thing that he's criticizing the Democrats, and that there's an openness now across the board to people trying to be reflective about what the shortcomings of this election have been. But I think that it misses like the underlying dynamic of what the Democrats represent, and in particular, an idea that I think is still pervasive on the left, that elections and who gets elected is what's going to determine whether things get better or worse. And of course, elections have a role to play, but I think that referencing polls and saying like these things are popular are true, but the question is, how are those things actually going to be organized and actually going to impact politics in the US? And at the level of just, we should run on these things because people support them, it doesn't actually embody a strategy for moving the needle on those questions. And I think we've lost a lot of ground in ceding to that kind of to the Democrats' approach to change, which is much more so, if you change who is in power in the Democrats, make sure that Democrats get elected, therefore the base of society will change. And I think that is not has not proven, and I think we really need to reject that as a strategy moving forward, because it's really gotten us here where we are.
Yeah, I very much agree. And one of the interesting things, David, is that there were all kinds of explanations thrown around very, very quickly right after the results started coming in. Most of them have collapsed as people have seen the data. So there were a lot of people claiming, for instance, that this was evidence that men in the United States would never elect a woman president. This was making the rounds a lot in the early going. Problem: white men were the only major demographic group among which the Harris vote rose as compared to the Biden vote. Almost every other demographic group, the Democratic vote went down. So similarly, the pundits were expecting a huge gender gap, exactly as Natalia was describing, over abortion rights, without recognizing precisely that dual phenomenon, that you could vote to defend reproductive rights and not vote for the Democrats. And for lots of people, this was a possibility. I think on the larger scale, one of the things that is going to have to be reckoned with on the left generally is that the Democrats have proved to be the more disciplined bourgeois party than the Republicans. This is something that, with all of the focus on moving the Democrats to the left, people are going to have to really contend with. The Republican apparatus lost their party to the Trumpites. Their historic leadership, the faction that has controlled that party, lost. Whereas the left completely failed in its attempt to colonize and transform the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is clearly, by almost every serious measure, the preferred choice of capital, of big business in the United States. And they have been the more stable party internally, and that stability, i.e., that attachment to the agenda of big business, is costing them electorally. And I would just, sort of add one or two further points on that. Consider how they lost Michigan, the Democrats, which was their state to lose. Now, obviously, anybody paying attention ought to have known that they had massively alienated, the Democrats had massively alienated the Arab American population in Michigan with the genocide in Gaza. And similarly, if you were going to try to hold that base that the Democrats have historically had in Michigan, well, you better be emphasizing working class issues. So what did Kamala Harris do? In her final campaign swing through Michigan, she brought white corporate Republican Liz Cheney with her. And so that was, they honestly believed in, Michigan, in Detroit, of all places, this predominantly Black, multiracial working class city, that no, don't bring, say, Sean Fain from the UAW, bring Liz Cheney. And it demonstrates that their myth that there were all these centrist Republicans waiting to jump on their bandwagon was entirely that a myth. Final point, just to add to Natalia's really, I think, incisive analysis of those voters who could be simultaneously pro-choice but not vote for the Democrats. Missouri is a really interesting case because there was an overwhelming passage of a referendum to raise the minimum wage, and the state went to Trump. And so we've got this disconnection between traditional working class issues and values and gender, so-called gender issues like reproductive rights, where people are still standing up for them and voting for them, but they don't see that as attaching them to the Democratic Party. And that's a huge lesson that the left in the United States is going to have to think through at a time when, for the really since the first Bernie Sanders campaign of 2016, there has been an orientation on winning and capturing the Democratic Party. It hasn't happened, and it's not going to happen.
Right. So let's pick up on that and look forward, because although some people on the left, of course, want to spend their time talking about what the leaders of the Democrats should do now, I'm not going to waste our time with that, because no one's going to talk the leaders of the Democrats into taking on Trump by transforming themselves into Bernie Sanders at his best, being a bold social democrat. I think it's much more useful to spend our time talking about what radicals in the US, like people who are listening to Victor's Children, can actually be doing now, what they should aim to do in the months ahead, and what they shouldn't spend their time doing. So, Natalia, would you like to start us off with some thoughts on this?
Sure. Well, I guess I'm going to get to the answer, but I wanted to start by saying a little bit about what I think is different now to 2016, because I do think a lot of people I'm talking to have 2016 in their mind. And of course, there's things that might play out similarly, but I actually think that we need to be very sober and acknowledge the fact that actually the left is in a weaker position right now than it was in 2016 internationally, that we are at the exhaustion and downturn of what was a global movement in response to many different layers of neoliberalism and life in late neoliberal capitalism that actually are on the wane, on the wax now, as opposed to which one is it? Anyway, so I think something that I think we really need to forefront is that for people who are living in the US who opposed Trump in 2016, when he got elected, I think there was this shock and there was this feeling of, this isn't normal, this is an aberration, we're going to do something about this and we're going to stop it. And then we're in 2024 now, and this is mainstream politics in the US now. What in 2016 felt like we're not going to let this infect our society. At the level of high politics, it has infected our society. So I think that that's something that really needs to be absorbed, and the fact of how far to the right mainstream politics have moved. We could start wherever you want, but I think this is a condemnation of lesser evil politics. The Democrats said that they are going to oppose Trump, and actually what they've done is further legitimize and further build on some of his most disgusting, heinous policies. So I think that really has to be understood, and we have to appreciate the fact that the right is not just going to go away because it's unpopular amongst the majority of people. The right is not just going to go away because of it. Oh, even if a Democrat wins in 4 years, the right is not going away. I hate to do this, but I had a tweet that I made when in the lead up to the Biden election. I said the question, it's not just about what a Biden administration opens up for the left to be able to do or not do. It's also about what it will certainly do to strengthen the right, meaning that Democratic Party politics in office actually, people say that it provides firmer ground for us to organize on the left, and we can have a discussion about that. But the reality is that this is something deeply rooted. And if it's deeply rooted, we have to have very serious strategic discussions about what it's going to take to actually push it back and actually put forward an alternative. So in terms of the question of what to do in the months ahead, I think there has to be two things at once, which is one, a soberness and a feeling that like I don't think this is just going to be like in 2004 when Bush won and then, people build an anti-war movement and then, I think that this is going to do something much more transformative to the way government works in the US. I think that because Trump was not as effective at getting things done in his first term, I think, they've developed a plan, this Project 2025. I think he's going to go in and take some pretty swift, decisive moves that have pretty serious implications. But obviously for the left, that doesn't mean that we just say, okay, like it's over, just hide. Like we really, really have to be prepared at all levels, everywhere we are, for defensive struggles, in defense of immigrants, in defense of trans comrades, in defense of the public sector, in defense of people who are going to be increasingly and ramped up blacklisting for being involved in the Palestine movement. Like, I think that there's no shortage of things and opportunities that are really going to be defensive in nature, and that I think can have a very serious impact. And I'll just say that I've been to a lot of meetings in the last week plus since the election results came out. Every meeting I've been to has quadrupled or more in size. Like there are a lot of people right now who are looking for what to do and how to do it. And to me, one of the most important things that we need to do is to accumulate the lessons from the previous period. And we can't just continue doing things in the same way, because we actually need to say and figure out like what is the strategy that's going to move the needle and allow us to have a bigger impact. And to me, that very much rests on the question of having spaces where we can engage and understand what we're doing and how we're doing it. And within that, I think for socialists to advocate for why our struggles need to be independent from the Democrats, and the fact that they weren't in the previous period, I think allowed our struggles to be subsumed and to be weakened. And we've come out of what was an extremely massive opportunity for the left with still with this conundrum of how do we break the fragmentation that we face? How do we have a voice across politics? And how do we actually start to win some of these demands that are so pressing and that are going to impact people's lives so decisively?
Yeah, it's going to be one of the most contradictory periods for the left, because I was describing earlier essentially the disintegration of the center in politics, certainly throughout the global north, but if pressed, I would make the same case for India, Brazil, and so on. And we have to be honest and acknowledge that overwhelmingly the right has capitalized on that disintegration of the center, not the left. And so one of the key strategic questions we need to ask ourselves is, where are we likely to see the centers of resistance in and through which opposition can be built and radicalization generated? And I continue to believe that the Palestine solidarity struggle will be front and center in that regard. And I say that for several reasons, not to romanticize, because there are huge weaknesses and huge problems in the movement, of which I, as an activist on the ground, am painfully aware. But one of the things that happened to the left in both the Occupy upsurge and the movement of the squares, and in the Black Lives Matter uprising is that we had very few, to use Alan Sears' term, infrastructures of dissent that actually were built and grew throughout that process. The radical left had almost nothing to show for new centers and networks of resistance, opposition, and mobilization. The Palestine Solidarity Movement has something in those areas. Take the fact, for instance, that as of the middle of the summer, I don't know the latest data, but as of the middle of the summer, Jewish Voices for Peace had grown by 300,000 in the US. Or take the growth of Students for Justice in Palestine. And notwithstanding the repression against the campus encampments and so on, SJP remains, and it has organizational forms on hundreds upon hundreds of campuses in the US. So that, combined with the fact that the Trumpites are probably going to unleash ever higher levels of violence against the Palestinian people. I mean, we now have an ambassador to Israel who believes there's no such thing as Palestine and Palestinians and says, take back the whole of the West Bank. Now, this is going to cause big fractures in the region, by the way. So I think for all of these reasons, the Palestine Solidarity Movement is not going away. And that's got to do with the legacy of global BDS. It actually does have the infrastructures of a movement, however weak. And that movement, as movements have been in the past, can be the grounds off which other struggles can be developed. So Natalia was absolutely right. The Trumpites are already making sounds about deporting every non-citizen student who is campaigning for Palestine. But of course, what that's going to mean is that the immigration struggle becomes directly linked to the Palestine solidarity struggle. And it's going to allow us potentially to expand some of these networks and fronts for mobilizing. Now, we've got terrible, terrible weaknesses in the movement. I was in a really interesting meeting in September in which all kinds of labor for Palestine activists in the United States were talking about the really terrific work they're doing on a local level. And yet they really do not have a larger unifying framework for organizing and building and strengthening that work. So there are lots of potential fault lines. There are a lot of weaknesses, but we do have a movement here, and it's a global movement which has some infrastructures. And I think this is going to become a key site of resistance moving forward. And the left, I think, is going to need to be one of the forces very pragmatically, practically raising ways of strengthening the infrastructure of the movement, deepening and coordinating labor for Palestine initiatives so that the movement is less campus-based than it is today. And if we can really strategize together and build the left within the movement as a really constructive but radical force, then this may give us one site for a kind of rebuilding project. I don't want to suggest it's everything. Migrant justice is going to move to the fore. Reproductive rights is going to continue to do so in some states. Trans rights is going to be a major front in many states as the Trumpites mobilize. But we need to recognize that we do have something here that we cannot squander in terms of this moment of global solidarity around Palestine.
Natalia, do you want to add anything before we move on?
Well, I really appreciate David's clarity around that. I guess just one thing I wanted to add, and I wonder what you all think of this, but I feel like one of the contradictions of the state of things in the US, but not just in the US, is that we've had kind of unprecedentedly huge spontaneous demonstrations that in and of themselves have not solved the problems of how we build those infrastructures of dissent. And I think that really figuring out where and how those conversations about getting from A to B develop, because I will say that I do think the default, at least in New York, but also at the national level, around how we start to make headway and bring people more around demands is just like, oh, we'll jump from demonstration to demonstration. And those are important. I want to be clear. I am for demonstrations. I will be at every demonstration. But I do think like the question of what movement spaces look like in the US, where people can join and participate and shape things and vote on things, has been so eroded. And in the Palestine movement, there are examples of where we're overcoming that, but then I think there's also tensions and ways in which the movement really needs to make a turn. And this isn't just the Palestine movement, but like there really needs to be a turn made towards entry points and where and how people can actually become part of the fabric of an organization. And I think for young people in particular who weren't around during like the bigger anti-war demonstrations and movements where there were actually places where those things happened, a lot of it feels like we're kind of trying to build those things from scratch. And I think I think the question of how those things get built and on what basis is actually quite challenging. And there's also, I think, different tendencies of people who feel like this is the time for us to kind of, center around the most radical possible thing we could do with the smaller numbers of people versus how to open some of those doors and figure out how to do that. And I've found very few places where that discussion is on the table, kind of in an open way amongst larger numbers of people. And I think it's a challenge. And I think this is I also think maybe a silver lining is people are going to be more ready and like in need of those conversations now, given that there's like even like a ramped up attack, even from what we've been facing currently.
Yeah, just to add a quick footnote to what Natalia said, I think that's absolutely right. That there is a dilemma posed within the movement right now as to whether mass movement building or increasingly sort of combative but smaller actions is the key to this movement, and often not a sense of how one can use appropriately combative tactics in a movement building way. And so there's a danger that parts of the movement become self-isolating rather than base building. And that's a real strategic issue. And I think we on the left need to do a better job of trying to intervene in this discussion and this debate. I think there is an opening, as I was suggesting, on the Labor for Palestine front. I was really struck by what good work lots of people are actually doing in this area, but there will be lots of challenges as well. But I think when we do have a movement that has some infrastructure and has a capacity for mobilization in this moment, then as a left, we're going to have to really figure out how to be some of the best builders of the movement who are also fighting for a certain kind of strategic clarity. It's not easy. It's not easy, particularly because, as Natalia said, our forces are not as strong as they once were and as they need to be. But at the same time, there is an opening here for us to try, if you will, to raise our game.
So I think those are some important points. And before we move any further, I do want to pick up one particular question that's been raised. I was listening to a particular episode of the podcast, The Dig, that went live on November the 9th. And listeners can find this in the show notes if they wish. On that episode, Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, one of the co-founders of the magazine Hammer and Hope, raised the question of building a third party. And I'm just going to quote Keeanga, a vehicle that can bridge the gap between what it is that the people want and what is necessary to achieve it, while recognizing that a viable new party, of course, seems impossible today in the US, and that Keeanga also noted that it won't come from a bunch of left groups getting together. So my question to either or both of you is, what place, if any, do you think the creation of a new party, and I don't mean by that a revolutionary socialist party, but some kind of broad left party, what place should that demand or that idea have in the politics of socialists in the US going forward?
Do you want to go first, David?
No, please start us off.
Okay.
Go ahead, Natalia.
I also listened to that podcast and I thought it was really good. I think it kind of comes back to this underlying historic conundrum that we've had in the US of having two capitalist parties, and that there's no kind of simple fix to how we overcome that challenge. But I think the left and the socialist left has to be clear that that is our goal, is to overcome that challenge. And we're not going to overcome it by saying it's too hard. We just have to kind of because we have no choice, we just have to fold our forces and be realistic and be inside the two-party system, because I think that I would argue we've seen pretty decisively where that's gotten us. I think that on pretty much every issue that the Democrats have claimed that they are the natural bearers of support, they have offered no way forward. And however hard that alternative is, I think it has to be front of mind, and we have to be talking about it now. Not to mention because a lot of people are also seeking out the answer to that question. But I think that there's something really tragic about the fact that we were told kind of repeatedly this last year that the main thing standing in between fascism and our ability to keep organizing was a Trump election. And so people, understandably through fear, but a lot of resources and time and energy went into campaigning for Harris. And Trump won anyway. Trump won, and now you were saying that now we're in fascism. So what does that mean in terms of where our forces are at and what our next steps are? We should have been spending the last year, vote however you want to vote. I understand in most states, there's only 2 people, but whatever, vote how you want to vote. But we should have spent the last year preparing for how we're going to amp up and be able to organize around the issues that are going to be pressing regardless of who's in office. And there's more to say about I don't think we're in fascism now. I do think we are going to be moving towards a much more authoritarian approach to government, and I think it's going to have pretty profound effects. But I don't think that means that our left can't organize. But my point is that there's a real need for us to figure out where some of those broad spaces, whether it's in the Palestine movement or whether it's the formation of a new party, where those things are going to come together. I think that there's this prevailing wisdom, I think, in the dominant kind of sections of the socialist left that's like, we build our forces by doing elections. And I think elections are a piece of it, but I actually think new electoral formations come out of our successes. They come out of moments where we've been able to actually assert a strategy and been able to kind of move politics on the ground towards a different type of approach. So I think that we should be saying at all times that we need a party, that we don't have one, that there's not a simple fix. It's not like we're going to declare one by just uniting the 3 of us and putting out a call. Like, I don't think this is simply a crisis of there not being a call. This is a crisis of people's expectations. It's a crisis of people's lives. It's a crisis of the ability to really, for people to see any type of alternative on offer. And therefore there's, an extremely slim continuum of politics that exist at the level of party politics. That said, I think that for socialists, the most important thing is to have spaces where these strategies and horizons can actually be discussed and contested. These things aren't going to be solved in our own little corners. They're going to be solved in the context of us taking up defensive struggles when our coworkers are facing harassment from anti-trans management, or when people are under threat of being deported for their positions on Palestine. Like, I think that there's going to be really important opportunities for us to start to sort through with many, many more people what the direction of our movements are and where it's all going. And that actually the fact that we don't have a third party or an independent party means that there's no things are very still localized. It's very hard to figure out how these things add up into something that's bigger than the sum of their parts. And I think that I do think we need to have that as something that is potentially achievable in the US. We can't give up on that, however hard it might be. Otherwise, I think that we kind of repeatedly default to saying there's no alternative. The only path is through the Democrats, and that repeatedly weakens our ability to actually wage the fights that need to be waged.
Right. Just picking up on that, if you don't raise the question of a left alternative to the 2 parties of big business, you are, as Natalia said, essentially saying that at least for 1 to 2 years out of every 4-year election cycle, all the energies of the left are going to get pulled into the confines of the Democratic Party and that the dead end that represents politically. So to be saying that we need to think outside the 2-party system about the need for a left alternative, that is important because it signals politically that the effort to win the Democrats to the left, whatever people think that means, is recognized as a dead end. But that is not a strategy for left politics in the United States. So I think that's the importance of that call. I think after that, a whole series of questions get raised. And along these lines, what have even semi-interesting experiments in this direction looked like in the United States and beyond in, I don't know, since the last New Left? Well, okay, the Peace and Freedom Party in California. It came into being essentially because there was a convergence of forces between the Black Power movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement. So there were organizations and movements with a social base that said, we want to actually contest elections in the state of California. Now, all kinds of weaknesses, all kinds of problems, but there was a sense that this was a movement party, Peace and Freedom. It was a political expression of real movements. And so that's going to be one of the really important discussions for serious left activists and organizers in the United States. If you were going to start to issue a call for a process, not for the creation of something immediately, but a call for beginning to establish a process by which movement building sections of the left would converge on the goal of trying to build some kind of left party formation, whatever that's going to look like, you have to establish where the social base and the social roots are. And so to take a negative example, the fact that neither the Cornel West campaign nor the Jill Stein campaign, a year out from the election, held meetings with all the key organizers and organizations of the Palestine Solidarity Movement. And rather than saying, how can we express your movement? How can we help build your movement by using the electoral front? There was just this kind of dropping in of campaigns. And so did we have hundreds of organizers here in Houston out building either of those campaigns? No. And that was true in most cities. Activists weren't taking over and creating a campaign that was in the first instance a movement campaign that had some sorts of directions for what its supporters should do at the ballot box. So to begin with, we need to think about those earlier models. I'll offer one other example. Why did the far right behind Marine Le Pen not win as expected in the last round of elections in France? Well, one of the answers is that the left social democratic formation, France Insoumise, actually campaigned around Palestine. And they went into the heavily Arab and immigrant working class suburbs of Paris, and they openly campaigned around Palestine. And the best activists and organizers there actually brought hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of youth who were geared up around Palestine and fighting the system into campaigning in these immigrant working class suburbs of Paris, where they did remarkably well. They actually produced new activists and organizers. And that's the sense in which, any project like this, and Keeanga is to be commended for raising this in that interview. But any project like this is going to have to also raise what I'll call the Ella Baker question, which is, how are we using organizing to create more organizers? Because the one thing that Ella Baker always insisted upon in building things like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is that our task when we go into a community is to actually create new organizers who will then do more organizing. And so if you've just gone in and given a great speech and moved on, we haven't built anything. And so it would need to be seen as an organizing project in the first instance in that kind of tradition. But it's the right call. And what it needs now is the kind of engaged discussion on the left by which some of the first steps are identified and how it relates to larger movement building projects, so it gets out of the tailwinds of pure electoralism.
Which takes us, of course, back. I just want to kind of make a connection here to what you were both saying, especially Natalia earlier, about the importance of actually not just having big mobilizations, but actually having organizations with entry points for new people to get involved. So there can be the ongoing building of a real movement at the base, which then opens up new political possibilities of different kinds. So I don't want us to get into predictions really beyond much what we've done. But I do think it's fair enough to say that it's likely that as the Trump administration moves to implement the kind of agenda that you've talked about, whether it's the attacks on immigrants, trans people, the remnants of the welfare state, remnants of corporate regulation, and as well, we haven't talked about this, but I think it's worth mentioning at least, of course, they're going to be trying to change in certain ways aspects of the US state's global strategy for preserving US imperial dominance. As all these things happen, the US the left in the US is going to face more state repression and also possibly more violence from the far right than it has most of the time in most parts of the country for a long time. So do you have any thoughts about how people on the left should try to conduct themselves in the face of these kinds of threats, and whether there are any lessons from history that are worth drawing on here as we in the US face these kinds of questions?
Well, I guess one thing, I think we established that I don't think Trump has a popular mandate, despite having won the election and the popular vote and the swing. Like, he doesn't have a popular mandate. However, he does have power and he will have an impact. So I think, I guess I just wanted to say that again, because I think there's two things. One is that I think there are some people who are feeling like, oh, it's not going to be that big of a deal. In 4 years, it's okay. It's going to go back to a Democrat, and that'll be that. On the other hand, I think it would be a really big mistake to say, now, okay, we have to go into hiding. We have to be underground. We're all of a sudden under severe attack. I think the making it a self-fulfilling prophecy would be the absolute worst thing we could possibly do. I'm sorry, this example just has been present in my mind since we lost Roe v. Wade with the Dobbs decision. But like, as soon as the Dobbs decision came down in the states that had trigger laws, the clinics were closed up and packed up shop and left. The only thing that's going to prevent those lines from being pushed back is if we can forge united struggles that actually are in defense of losing those things. Now, I think that there is going to be ramped up scary repercussions that are being put forward to try to prevent people and that are going to impact people who organize. The best possible protection that we have is if we can forge united struggles that people can see, that people feel like they're not going out on a limb on their own, and that people can join, and that some kind of resistance could be forged. I think that is the most important thing. I think if we retreat to the feeling of it's too dangerous, we can't do anything, we will it has an impact on our ability to defend and protect what we already have and what we have built, which obviously is in and of itself insufficient. I honestly, I feel like there's going to be kind of an adjustment period, but I have a lot of confidence that these things are going to present themselves, and there are going to be opportunities to organize and to push back these things. At the same time, I don't think this is just like some small superficial changes. I think that these are going to have generational implications, and we need to be thinking along the lines of, understanding that this situation isn't just like it's like a speed bump and all of a sudden things are going to go back to the way they were before, however shitty they have been before. Like, things are actually going to get harder, and we can't tell people that this is just an aberration. It's going to be okay really soon because the majority of people support us. We're going to have to go through this experience together. But I do think it's going to be really hard, and it's going to mean much more at the global level instability. We haven't really talked about this, but I think the implications on the imperial world order are going to be drastic and are going to be very, very intense. But also at the economic level in the states, at the organizing level in the states, I think it would be hard to overstate that this is actually going to change the ground on which we stand, and we need to be prepared for that. We need to be sober about that, but we also need to insist that we can develop an alternative horizon and vision that helps people better understand and better explain what it is that we're going through. But this is going to be quite a long struggle, and is something that I think we need to build. Whatever spaces we're building, I think it needs to be cognizant of that, of what we're facing. Otherwise, we risk either burning out or having overstated sense of what it is that we're going to change, like in the month-to-month term. So I know that's a little bit abstract, but that's kind of how I've been thinking about it. And I know David's going to have some really good historical examples to help us better understand it. But that's kind of where I'm at in my mind.
Yeah, and let me start by fully agreeing with that. We are into a more unstable, volatile, and dangerous political moment. There's just no way around any of that. And we're going to experience defeats. That just has to be said. Now, then the challenge becomes, how does the left process and learn from those defeats? What does it do to try to minimize them and to build amidst defeats? And that's going to be really, really critical. I'll go back to my Ella Baker example in the civil rights movement, because we sometimes tend to forget that these were young people at the end of the 1950s and the early 1960s who were essentially committing themselves to go into some of the most violent parts of the U.S. South, particularly Mississippi, where this was dangerous to go down and simply try to do voter registration. And they had tons of failures in the process. They did get run out of some towns, but they also sunk some roots here and there. They began to create new networks of organizers, which, by the way, one of the really interesting things doing the reading is you see them draw back in an older layer over time who had been doing that work a decade earlier and find themselves compelled to kind of reactivate to help protect and guide the young people who were coming in. But that movement did have a sense that there were no easy victories coming, that they were going to have a multi-year perspective, and that the only thing which guaranteed them success was that when they left a town after spending some months with organizers, being there, showing individuals how you do sit-ins at a local drugstore that would not serve African Americans, how you get people registered for the vote, and so on, that they left new organizers behind. And if the networks of organizers didn't grow, then they'd failed. And, I think those kinds of lessons of long-term organizing projects that were highly adaptational, in other words, they knew how to shift tactics as they needed to. They knew how to learn from the local terrain. I mean, this was one of the really impressive things, is that people went in and they talked to local activists and they learned from it. But the movement did sink roots over time. And, one of the really fascinating stories, and I'll be quiet with these examples after this, but is to see some of these organizing sessions and to realize that one of them at the Highlander Center, Rosa Parks went to, and she was learning, and she told them at the end of it, all the activists who'd come to this training were asked at the center on the final day, sum up what you're going back to and what you're going to do. And Rosa Parks basically said, our situation is hopeless. Our local terrain in Montgomery, nothing is going to move. And of course, we know what she was leading 3 to 4 months later. And so it's also that recognition that once you get those organizers learning from one another, we just don't know when the first breaks will happen. But we need to go in with that long-term perspective that we are rebuilding. We're sinking roots. It's a multi-year, maybe generational project, but it's been done before. Organizers have walked these sorts of pathways before for all the differences in our moment. And I think it is useful to sort of remind ourselves of all the odds that a generation like the Freedom Riders and others who went into the South faced, and the violence and the Klan-type terror that they faced. And yet they did ultimately have a huge social impact, even if 50 years later, so much of what they actually fought for and gained has been eroded and pushed back. They made something fundamental happen, and they did it with that kind of long-term strategic organizing perspective.
One question that I'll just raise, and it's a very leading question, I guess, but occurs to me, and that's about what the U.S. left can learn from the left in other countries where people have more recent experiences of repression, or situations that are somewhat analogous to what's the situations likely to be in the U.S. India and Brazil come to mind right away for me, as two countries where you still have capitalist democracy, but you've actually had the far right in power. Now, again, there are major differences between the societies, so I don't want to suggest it's all the same. But I'm just interested if you have any thoughts about people in the U.S. learning from experiences elsewhere in relation to the specific challenges that they will face in the years ahead.
Why don't you go first on this one, David?
Okay, well, I'll start again, David, with Palestine. And, I do that because we need to remind ourselves in this moment that resistance continues by the Palestinian people. They continue to fight and to organize in circumstances that truly are at some level incomprehensible for most of us. And to me, that's always a sort of guiding principle. We owe it to them to figure out ways, even when we're suffering repression on a campus or in a workplace, to figure out what we can do with greater possibilities in terms of the pure and simple legal and military repression kind of domain. The left has dealt with repression before. I was using the example of the U.S. South earlier, and we just need, we do need to remind ourselves. Now, there were big strategic debates, and ultimately the armed self-defense wing became much stronger over time in terms of those organizing projects in the South. I'm not going to prejudge what the right kinds of tactical and strategic decisions are going to be in one situation or another. But the left has survived in part because it knew how to adapt to circumstances of repression, even where we paid enormous costs in that regard. And we are not in as dire circumstances in the United States today as the left has been in many, many other circumstances historically. So it's a question of being highly creative. I said I was going to stay with Palestine. We need to figure out ways right now. I'm having these discussions here in Houston. We need to protect all of the Palestinian solidarity activists and organizers who are here on visas, for instance. Students on student visas need to be protected right now in this moment in terms of just who's stepping up in all kinds of ways in the organizing. So there are all kinds of security protocols we need to take more seriously in this environment. That's absolutely true. But we can go to, all kinds of cases where people have organized against authoritarianism, and there are lessons to be learned, but stay close to home quite often in the first instance. And so that's why I keep going back to the organizers in the US South. I think in some ways that could be the closer analogy for folks in the US today, that, more serious repression and confrontation by organized right-wing forces who actually come out to physically intimidate left organizing. So let's learn from those lessons of the civil rights movement, for instance, in the South.
Yeah, that's a really helpful response. And you have my gears turning about things that I want to read more about and think about more. I don't have like a decisive answer to this, but I do think that we should remember that what we're facing in the US is not just US. Like this is actually part of a dynamic that is happening globally. And I think that it is, but it's also true that because of the US's place as still the maybe, wounded beast, but still dominant empire, it does have severe impact other places. Which maybe this is taking a bit of a different angle, but I do think that also means that there will be renewed opportunities. Well, there's always opportunities, but kind of obvious opportunities for cross-border solidarity and for international struggles to potentially build on and draw from each other. I think, each situation is particular and unique, but I do think we have to come back to the fact that this is happening because there's a very, very deep systemic rot that is not going to go away, that there's a reason why authoritarianism is rising now. And however dark and dystopian, that also means that that lefts have potentials, and there are people in every situation where authoritarianism is raining down who are meeting in rooms and trying to figure out what the next steps together and how to do that. But within that, I do think that the underlying strategic vision matters quite a lot. And I think that there's a real need for us to have at the international level, have conversations about how did we get here and what are the lessons that can be drawn from. It was only 10-ish years ago that the pink tide was winning, 20 years ago now, damn, that the pink tide was kind of winning left-wing populist governments across South America. The Arab Spring was taking hold. These things were not very long ago. So we know that in part, this authoritarian response is happening in reaction to some of the limitations of our own struggles and our own movements. I think that there's a real need for us to have kind of the view in mind of these periods of struggle, and an understanding that these struggles, absolutely, I don't think there's any question that there are going to be fights and resistance and struggle. To me, how and exactly what they look like is going to differ. But I think that we really need to emphasize the question of how do we have more spaces and movement spaces, but also organizations and conversations that bring more people in, that can orient us on what some of the tasks are and what it's going to take to be able to participate and intervene in those moments more effectively. And now, obviously, in a very different context than we were 20 years ago, and even 10 years ago. So I think that is a global dynamic, and that everybody is kind of in the process of learning from it and trying to better understand it. And I will say that I do think that in the US left has more to learn from the lefts in other countries than we have to teach, because they've been through much more monumental experiences and struggles. And I think that there's too much to say about the particularities of each of those. But I think it's a pretty important thing that we recognize as people in the US left who have, we haven't quite ousted any dictators anytime recently. So that's what I'll say about that.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for everything you do, David.
Yeah, thank you.
Before ending this episode of Victor's Children, I'd just like to give a shout out to another podcast. That's a Tender Riot, a podcast that's focused on abolition, socialism, and relating to each other as whole human beings. It's hosted by Sean and Danae, who are two members of the Tempest Collective, the US socialist group. Check it out, a Tender Riot. That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.